In the previous episode, we saw that Java is pretty similar to Python in some ways. We still use the same building blocks to construct our programs. It is just that the syntax is a little bit different. And we will see more of that in this episode when we take a look at some of the basic repetition structures, such as, for example, the for loop. We will keep it very simple and focus on the loops. So the task that we're trying to accomplish is just to print the numbers 0 to 9 on the screen. First using a for loop and then using a while loop. The flowchart for what we will do next looks exactly the same as it did when we worked with repetition structures in Python. So remember, all we have already learned about how to use repetition structures in our code still applies. As you can see, I have prepared a project for us where I have added the corresponding Python code, but I have also added the general syntax for the loops in Java. So if we take a look at the first one here, the for loop, we can see that the general syntax in Java looks like this. We have the keyword for, then we have a parenthesis with 3 parts, an initialization, a condition, and an iteration, separated by semicolons. The initialization is done before the loop starts. So it only happens once, and that is before the loop starts. And here we specify what value we should start the loop with. Then we have the condition that, it tells us how long we should continue in the loop. And the last bit here, the iteration, it tells us how we should change the value, how much we should increase or decrease it with after each loop, or after each iteration in the loop. The condition is checked before we enter each iteration in the loop. And the last bit where we update the value, it happens before we enter each new iteration. So it's easy to think of it as if it happens in the very end of each iteration in the loop. And then of course we have a code block containing the statements that we want to loop over. So let me create the loop or write the code for it, and then we can have a look at how it looks. And here we have it, and before we take a look at the individual parts, let's run it and just make sure that it works. And as we can see, it prints the numbers 0 to 9. And let us take a look at what we did here. So we see the initialization, it's this part. Here we create a new variable, a counter variable, that we will use to specify how long we should continue in this loop, which is the condition. As long as I is less than 10, we will continue in the loop. And after each iteration, we will increase the value. This one may look a little bit different, or this might look a little bit weird, so I will change it to I plus equals 1. So after each iteration in the loop, we will increase I by 1. So the first iteration is 0, the second iteration it is plus 1, 1. Next iteration plus 1 again, so it becomes 2. So we see here initialization, condition, and the change after each iteration. And as we saw before I changed it here, in Java, we can actually write an increment by 1 as I plus plus. So 2 pluses means that we increment the value by 1. Okay, so next let us have a look at how we would write a while loop in Java. And if we first, before we start writing the code, take a look at the general syntax, we can see that we use the keyword while, then we have parentheses, and within the parentheses we have a condition. And then we have our code block that should also have an ending curly bracket. And the statements in here are the one that we repeat each iteration. And we cannot forget, or we should not forget, to update whatever variable we are using for the condition. So if we write it in code, we can see how it corresponds. And we can see here, if we compare it to the Python version, it looks fairly similar. First, we declare a variable. We do the same up here. And then we have our while loop down here. While I is less than 10, but we have it in parentheses, so that's a difference. Then we print it, it's the same, and then we update I after each iteration in the loop. And we can see I use I++ here. I could have written it as this instead, but we will keep it as I++. And if we run this one, we'll see that we get 0 to 9 as our output too. Java also have a third loop called the do-while loop. It will always execute at least once, even if the condition is not met to begin with. It sounds strange, I know, but let us have a look at a practical example, and hopefully it will make more sense after that. So how does this do-while loop look in code? Well, if we first take a look at the general syntax for it, we can see that we have a keyword, do, then we have the code block with the statement that we want to loop over, and then it ends with the keyword while and our condition. So the condition is checked after the loop has actually gone through one iteration. And we must not forget the semicolon after the loop. Let me write the code and we can see how it looks in actual code. And before we talk about it, let's run it and see what happens. We can see that we get an endless stream of zeros. So what did we do wrong? Well, we created a never-ending loop, an infinite loop, because we forgot something. We forgot to update our I. So every time that we check I, it's still gonna be 0. So now if we try to run it again, after I have fixed this little bug here, we can see that we get the same output as with the other loops, 0 to 9. But what is actually happening here? So we're declaring a variable as 0. Then we will always execute this loop at least one iteration. So we go in, we print it, then we update it, and then we check if we should go back and do it again. And we can see how this works. If I set I equals to 100, which is way more than this condition, but if we run it, we will see that it goes through and prints 100. So we declare it and initialize I to 100, go in and print it, update I so that it's now 101, and then we check our condition. 101 is not less than 10, so we will exit the loop. So the do-while loop always executes at least once. But we see here that we have I++. We can actually look at one thing here, because as I++ updates I can put it in here. So I print it and update it. So if we run it, let's see what happens. We can see that we get the same output as before. But what happens if I move the plus plus to before I? Let's see if it makes any difference. Let's see if it works. We can see that now we print 1 to 10 instead. So there is a slight difference, and it depends on where we put the plus plus. If we put the plus plus before the variable, it means that the variable will be updated before we use it. So it will get its new value, then we print it. If we, on the other hand, put plus plus after the variable name, then what happens is that we will use the current value, print it, and then after this instruction is finished, then I is increased by 1. So plus plus before, update it before we use it. Plus plus after means that we update it after we have used it.